Okay, kick us off, Creon. Give us the kind of tour d'horizon. Where are we in global trade? And I'm thinking we're going to talk specifically, obviously, about the EU and I suppose about China as well, and maybe about Donald Trump. But give the kind of tour d'horizon.
Well, I think we have to start with Donald Trump.
Yep.
Going back to last year, we had what you can describe as a massive shock to the global trade system when Trump came into office. I mean, if you go back to 2024, average tariff rates in the world were 2.5%. By January of this year, the average tariff rates in the US were 2.5%. By January of this year, they were up to around 16% or so, the average tariff rate in the US. And then we had the US Supreme Court ruling. This took away, if you like, the president's preferred instrument for wielding the tariff. He lost that because of the Supreme Court. He put in place temporary measures. Average tariff rate came down maybe to around 8 or 9%. But we're now, as we've just seen from the latest news, in a situation where he is threatening once again to use the tariff instrument, 100% tariffs on countries that have digital services tax. And so I think the question really is, are we now headed for another round of trade tensions? I think it raises a whole bunch of issues. I mean, to some extent, he's able to do this because there are other bits of legislation which the Supreme Court did not address, which he can use, not as effectively, not as perhaps flexibly, but which he's now kind of figured out how he's going to use those other tariffs. And so I think the question will be those countries that are in the forefront of dealing with this threat, I mean, particularly EU, are they going to behave the same way this year as they did a year ago? Or are they going to say, well, actually, what is the point of signing a deal with a president who, a year on, says, well, none of those deals matter. For some other issue, I'm going to take a different approach.
Do you agree with that, Sam, that we are then at a stage where there is a new iteration of all the things that started with Trump then?
I think we're definitely in a new stage when it comes to Trump essentially replacing some existing duties that already exist. I mean, from an automotive perspective, we have to clarify that the tariff rates that apply sit outside of the measures currently being reviewed, given that they're justified on the basis of Section 232. I suppose the risk is that as Trump makes continued interventions, that he could call into question some of the existing arrangements. We've seen this happen just recently with the EU, where he threatened car tariffs if the EU didn't implement its obligations under its own agreement with the US. The EU then went ahead and did so. So I think this uncertainty is the status quo. I on the earlier panel, there's a call for certainty.
Yes, I enjoyed the call for certainty. It was Stephen, wasn't it? Best thing we could have is certainty. I was thinking, okay. Second best thing then.
yeah.
I mean, do you have but before we focus on the EU, which we should, do you have a kind of sense of, either of you, of a shift in Donald Trump's ability / desire to shake things up globally when you think of the increasingly parlous domestic situation that he's in?
I think there has been some evidence that he is receptive to domestic pressure with concerns around pricing, but this has largely materialized in sectors such as food and the like. We know he's still very volatile and he'll still lash out and make new threats. He's had one legal instrument taken away from him, as Creon has alluded to, well said explicitly, but he has others. I just think that this uncertainty can also become quite micro. I mean, even in the UK sense, when we're talking about a quota of 100,000 vehicles on a first-come, first-served basis, assessed quarterly, that doesn't allow for any growth over time within that quota. So it's going to become a bit of a feeding frenzy on the UK side, and the UK is going to ask for more, ask for accommodations, ask for an uplift. So even where we think we've got a good arrangement, we're going to have to ask him for more. And then he's going to say, well, what are you going to give me back?
Yeah. And of course, it's not just him. I mean, Creon, he is going to be, well, we assume he's going to be out of office in 2 years. Let's make that assumption. But there are plenty of Democrats. Paul Krugman, the Nobel Prize winner, saying the other day that he kind of agrees that actually there are going to have to be tariffs against particularly Chinese auto imports to the US, and that he sort of sees why those are important, etc. In other words, there is, and it has been through history as well, isn't it, on the democratic side of the ledger, also an interest in tariffs. So you wonder whether there are changes in the US approach to the outside world that long outlived Trump politically.
I think it's certainly true that once a new tariff regime has been put in place, it's very hard for the Democrats to wind it back. And we saw that with President Biden. There were tariffs that Trump put in place in his first administration, and they didn't get wound back in the way that was expected. But on the other hand, I think there's something unique about the US approach and actually the Chinese approach. I mean, these are the only two countries that are fundamentally coercive in how they're trying to use trade policy. So, going back to the previous panel, which I thought was excellent, I mean, it was kind of presented as if this is the whole world. It's not actually the whole world. It's two countries, two really big countries, who are choosing to take this approach. And so one of the things I think is alongside all the discussion about how you sort of make your supply chains resilient and so on, how you get more information, just remember that's all very expensive.
Yeah.
So the extent that we can also shore up the system among those countries who believe in it, which is, according to the WTO figures, some 70% of world trade is still on WTO terms. I think that's a very good complement to the other things that private business is going to have to work. So I think we need to give some emphasis to that.
And that then brings us to Europe, Sam, and to particularly to Made in Europe. Tell us about it. Tell us what the balance of thinking is at the moment.
Well, from a European perspective, it very much echoes a lot of the conversation this morning. I think the word protectionist was used positively for the first time in a conference, at least that I've heard for quite a long time. But that is what the EU is trying to do. It said we want to ensure that more production in key sectors, including automotive, happens within the EU rather than outside of it. And unfortunately for the UK, from this perspective, we're not in the EU anymore, which means we're going to now be, as the UK, in a perpetual state of negotiation with the EU to try and be accommodated, to try and plug into these different Made in Europe schemes. And it's not a one and done. We've mentioned the Industrial Accelerator Act so far. There's also parallel initiatives on corporate fleets and carbon credits, which are linked to the Industrial Accelerator Act, but not within it, where we've actually had some murmuring of assurances. But there's also other measures. We had steel on the panel earlier, just tomorrow. So July 1st is tomorrow, right? Yes. We're about to be hit with new steel tariffs from the EU, and the UK's quota share is going to be diminished. We're going to do the same back to them. Is that measure targeted at the UK? No. Are we going to suffer as a result and going to need to negotiate our way out of it? Yes. So we're kind of in this perpetual state of having to deal with the UK, with the EU from the outside. And in some areas we will be accommodated, in others we won't. But in every instance, we're going to have to give something back. And this is where I'm not always sure we think laterally. What is the EU going to ask in return when it comes to this desire to onshore production within Europe? It might ask us to match EU economic security measures. This could involve tariffs on active cathode material. That came up earlier, for example, if that's the whole issue around rules of origin and why we can't comply with the rule at the end of the year and need it to change. It could involve tariffs on electric vehicles, which we don't do yet. It could mean that we're suddenly having greater scrutiny of investments into the UK because they're worried about the ownership structures and whether they're being used to circumvent EU measures. This is life now, and if I'm honest, it's great for me as a consultant, but it's not necessarily great for everyone in the room.
It's good to be honest, because everyone was thinking that.
Yeah.
You've now said it, which is kind of prevents any further harm, as it were. Yeah. Just on the point then, just to drill down on that permanent relationship that you say we're now in, and we are obviously now in, from a political standpoint, it kind of divides into build-ups to summits and summits, doesn't it? And summits that sometimes happen, are sometimes postponed. And we've got this thing that's now been postponed, I think the timing of it, but is the next kind of moment where expectations are raised and then, well, what realistically do we expect from this summit, which happens now when?
I'm not sure they've said actually when it's going to be, but
it could be one for the Secretary of State. When
not unreasonably, I think the EU said, well, actually, let's see who your Prime Minister is before we go into what.
It's that certainty that we were calling for earlier on.
personally, I mean, I'm not as expert as Sam on the precise detail, but I think we're kind of stuck in terms of how we realize how much we've lost in terms of GDP, in terms of GDP per capita. It's somewhere between 6 to 8% of GDP per capita has been lost since Brexit. And there is that temptation that not a temptation, a desire to get as much of it as we can back through a closer relationship. But the difficulty is that the things that would really make a difference, joining the customs union, joining the single market in terms of capturing a lot of that GDP per capita back again, really do not make sense politically, because the UK would be something like 15% or so of EU GDP. Now, if you're let's say Norway and a very small part of EU GDP, you can accept regulations that are determined essentially in the EU, and you might not have much more influence if you were in the EU. But for us, we would be saying we'll accept the determination of regulations, but with no influence, no real influence on how they take place. So I think this is a fundamental problem in terms of using that relationship to capture more value. I mean, there's some things we can do, and Sam is probably the expert on what those things are, but I don't think we should fool ourselves into terms of how much more we can get back in a kind of politically realistic way.
Do you look forward to the summit, Sam, as a moment of sea change?
It won't be a moment of sea change. I think the UK, on the UK side, we sometimes get ourselves into a bit of a frenzy in the run-up to these things and start making promises we can't uphold in terms of both the economic growth that will be delivered and what will be achieved materially. I think in terms of priorities for this sector this year, I think you have the rules of origin deadline at the end of the year. We've heard on, I think, every single panel or intervention so far has mentioned it as something that needs to be resolved. And as it stands, whilst there is the possibility of some sort of extension or modification, we don't know what that looks like. We don't actually have uniform agreement when it comes to industry in the UK and on the EU side, although we're close. So I think delivering that is the priority, and then this whole conversation around Made in Europe is obviously key, and any assurances the UK can get there is going to be welcome. But of course, even on the EU side, that legislative process is going to take a little longer. I'm a big fan of, in this context, incremental progress, even though it doesn't necessarily win you many friends if you're a politician.
And do you agree about the customs union and the single market, that really politically these are, which, I mean, we're going to hear from Peter Kyle in a minute, and I saw him, I think it was in the FT recently, so utterly dismissing even the customs union as something that should be planned for and thought about. But there is, of course, a new Prime Minister coming in.
So I think customs union is oddly more difficult. It would actually be the one thing that would solve the rules of origin issue we've been discussing, given that that's all the customs union really delivers over and above what exists now. But where I do think there is some difference under Labour than perhaps the Conservatives before is the willingness to attempt to reintegrate the UK into what I refer to as the EU single market for goods. So this is not a discussion around services, it's around essentially trying to get more mutual recognition of conformity assessment. We've got a consultation on Euro 7 out at the moment, where it's essentially saying the UK is just going to align with the EU approach, and hopefully we can discuss something with the EU on that basis. The challenge here is the EU's response is, that all sounds well and good, but we've got that with Switzerland and they had to take freedom of movement. I personally think freedom of movement is great, but I'm not sure that view is held by
held in Makerfield and other places. Let me throw it open to anyone who wants to ask a question. We've got a few minutes still. I just want to throw it open as well to the idea of, because someone mentioned earlier on, and we've talked about China and the United States and the EU, obviously, and the sort of bloc side of it. Someone mentioned the deals that we've done with India and the other FTAs that there are. Has that dried up now, or is that a thing?
So I mean, all countries have responded, if you like, to Trump by looking for other trade arrangements, and indeed, I mean, the EU perhaps has been the most effective in that respect, but we've also pursued that. I think one really interesting trading group we are part of, which is has the initial CPTPP, which is a group of Asian countries.
Which Greg Clark mentioned, didn't he, as well?
And I mean, the interesting thing about this is that when we joined it with the previous government, everybody knew that actually in terms of trade, it didn't do very much because we already had trading arrangements with the vast majority of members. But as a strategic play, it possibly could turn out to be far more significant in the present context. This is because if you take the EU and CPTPP and you put them together, you have essentially more than 30% of world GDP, close to 50% of world trade. So as a strategic play, to shore up that system, as I mentioned earlier, this might well be the way to go. And indeed, the EU and CPTPP have started a kind of alliance focused on this. So going back to Sam's points about approaching the EU, the other way, maybe, to get the kind of arrangement that we want with the EU would be through that alliance arrangement, through an alliance between CPTPP and the EU, if you like, as a complement to our direct negotiations.
So Creon knows I disagree with him, but we don't need to retread that. I think if you want to go to the audience for questions.
Well, I mean, does anyone want to ask a question? Because otherwise you can retread it. Because I think people are gripped by the current conversation. That's the positive way of putting it. Or you could also say waiting for lunch. Although they've got plenty more to happen till lunch. So don't be too thoughtful about that. Yeah, tell us why you disagree.
Why you disagree,
yeah.
Well, so CPTPP is one of those things that people who are very into foreign policy love the idea of, but in practice it's just a free trade agreement. It's just bilateral trade agreements between a number of countries with some essentially coordination around rules of origin. And in terms of the UK's existing trade agreement with the EU, it goes beyond what's in CPTPP, and I also don't think the EU CPTPP dialogue is going to amount to very much, because the one thing you could do, which is join up essentially the pan-Euro-Mediterranean zone on rules of origin with the CPTPP accumulation zone, is not going to happen because the EU doesn't even want the UK in the European one, so why would it let it in via the back door via CPTPP? So I think it's a nice exercise, it makes people feel good, but I don't think it's a commercial outcome.
I mean, my counter would be that we're in a world where, if you like, political and foreign policy issues to some extent dominate trade and investment. So in a way, the political foreign policy aspects of that alliance could deliver what we need in the trade space, rather than, in a sense, starting in the trade space to look in the other direction.
I would acknowledge it would be better for Creon to be right about this than me.
Right. That's a reasonable acknowledgement. Yeah. Final thought about the industry then, how it positions itself in the hugely uncertain global trade environment that you've just outlined.
Yeah.
Creon?
So I think the number one issue for me was to go with net zero as quickly as possible, frankly. Right. I mean...
reasoning being?
So I think, if that's where the world will be very soon, to, if you like, delay our transition is going to make us less competitive in the future. So whatever, I fully accept you need government support, you need financing, but I think the suggestion that somehow we should hold back our transition to support the UK car industry just doesn't make sense to me. You're not making a speech
in favour of the ZEV mandate, are you?
I'm just saying, let's go, whatever it may mean in practice, let's go hard to net. Well, yeah, effectively, yes.
I just think it needs to think much more laterally about trade-offs. Every time you ask for something, think about what it's going to cost and whether you're willing to pay it. Because I think we're very good at asking for things, and then when the answer comes back, we're very often very displeased. But we could get ahead of that slightly.
Creon, Sam, thank you both very much. Huge round of applause, please, for them. Thanks a lot, guys.